Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc. I'm here today with Daniel Susskind, who is at the Institute for Ethics and AI at Oxford University, also at King's College, London, the author of multiple books. This book came out about 7 or 8 years ago, co-authored. It's called The Future of the Professions, How Technology Will Transform the Work of Human Experts. Again, very, very timely book. Next book after that is A World Without Work, Technology, Automation, and How We Should Respond. Again, also very timely. And this most recent book is called Growth, A History and a Reckoning. And I figure you could have written this trilogy in the reverse order because you kept alluding to this question of growth and mentioning growth and trying to figure out, is growth always good? Or are there some costs to growth that we should engage? And of course, even in day one or page one of the growth book, I immediately started thinking in terms of like a production possibility frontier, which I was very glad by the time I got to the end of the book that you had that.
It appears, yeah.
Yeah. But, I think almost every economic question can be boiled down to, right, trade-offs and are we on the frontier or are we not on the frontier? And I think what you're trying to do in this book, Growth, is really go back and investigate not just the question of growth and what caused growth, but really the literature on growth. And the literature on growth has grown perhaps more rapidly than the economy or the thing that it's attempting to describe and explain has grown. And I think for about half the people out there, we just take growth as good, as given. And then we've got another strain of people who are questioning it and perhaps even committed to the idea that it is bad. And of course, either one of those is limiting. And I think you try to explain that growth is good, but it comes at a price. So maybe I guess where we could start is, I remember when I was in graduate school in the 80s and 90s, there was sort of a consensus around growth, or there was a consensus around the explanation for why we have this huge discontinuity, and it was called the big push theory. And I don't think you used that term, but it was the one, right, that Harrod Domar model, the idea that, if you just add a bunch of investment, physical capital, you'll get this wonderful growth. But in a way, it wasn't really a coherent explanation. So I guess maybe the first place to start is, where did this idea of growth as something that needed to and could be explained come from? I mean, because it really, for a long time with Malthus and all the rest, there really was no thought that this could be possible.
Yeah. I think what's really interesting about the idea of economic growth, and you set it out really nicely there, which is that, it sits at the center of our common lives together as societies, as citizens, and it has attracted enormous amounts of attention from economists in recent decades. But what's interesting about it is that if you go back to the 1950s, almost no economists, policymakers, politicians, anyone, is talking about the idea of economic growth. It is despite the fact it's sort of all-consuming today, and consumes the attention of academics, consumes the attention of political conversation. It's a very modern, a very recent phenomena, and I mean the reason why growth first becomes a priority, a sort of policy priority, and that's what really leads it. That it becomes a policy priority first, and then economists are kind of playing catch up, trying to make sense of it and make themselves relevant in providing explanations for it. But the thing that puts it on the sort of the agenda in the first place is war, and in particular the Second World War. So in the 1940s, the British government asks the sensible question, which is, if we think of the economy as a pie, how much of the pie can we slice up and dedicate to the war effort, and how much do we need to keep behind for citizens? And they don't know. They can't answer it because there isn't a reliable measure of the size of the economy. And so in response, in Britain, it's John Maynard Keynes. In the States, it's Kuznets. But essentially, they collectively develop this measure that becomes, by the end of the century, known as GDP. But the thing is, of course, that GDP itself isn't growth. Growth is the pursuit of ever more GDP. And what puts that on the radar is the next war, the Cold War. Because, in the Cold War, there are no traditional metrics of who's winning. Territory gained, soldiers lost, equipment destroyed, and so on. And growth becomes a kind of proxy measure for who is winning between the US and the Soviet Union. In part, it's a proxy measure because it gives a sense of who might be able to win in the event that the sort of in the event that the Cold War turned hot, who could fund a bigger military through having a bigger economy. But it was also, of course, a battle of ideas, between market-based system in the States, central planning in the Soviet Union, and growth became a kind of a proxy of who was winning that battle of ideas too. And so this era of growthmanship starts. And what happens as the 20th century sort of fades, as the 20th century goes on and the sort of demands of war fade away, the pursuit of growth sort of stubbornly remains behind. That it's this thing that turns out to be associated with almost every measure of human flourishing. So although it's incredibly important today for many reasons, it sort of got to its pole policy-making position almost by accident because of the demands of the wars that occupied the first chunk of the 20th century.
Well, I mean, there were these proto-economists, right, like the mercantilists, who were concerned with kind of taxable assets or concerned with the amount of specie, right, that was in the economy. I mean, was their problem that they were thinking in terms of zero sum, right? So if they got more gold, it meant that some other country had less gold, right? And
Yeah.
it was just fighting over a fixed pie.
Yeah. So I think the big shift that happens in the 20th century is, and you can point to lots of ways in which the classical economists, people like Smith, Ricardo, Marx, Mill, and so on, actually less Marx, but a way in which a lot of the classical economists wrote about growth. But what they all had in common was this view, and it's sort of what you're saying, this view that the economy, although it might grow temporarily, was inevitably tending towards some kind of stationary state, that growth could not go on forever. And what happens in the 20th century is that various, particularly mathematical stories, are told that suggest that actually infinite growth is possible, that we can keep on growing the economy, that there isn't some stationary state towards which we're tending. And I think that's the big, in sort of economic thought with respect to growth, that's the big shift that happens in the 20th century. And it's an idea, of course, that perhaps we'll talk about this. It's an idea, of course, that has particularly frustrated and irritated some critics of growth who think the idea of infinite growth is technically impossible and practically foolish.
Well, I mean, in a way, the critics of growth, they are kind of inheriting the tradition of classical economics, right? I mean, if you, whenever you write an economics paper, at least in microeconomics, I mean, you start by proving that equilibrium exists, and then you show how you get there. And so, I mean, everything is based on decreasing returns.
Yes.
And then when you move over to macro, then they're like, oh, okay, yeah, you can have a steady state that just includes this constant growth. And I think most microeconomics folks are kind of puzzled because in micro, I mean, of course, we now have increasing returns and network theory and so forth. But the basic core model that every economist learns always has diminishing returns and equilibrium. And so, I mean, has there been this tension between
Yeah,
like
I
the,
think
the
that's
core
I think
it's like the
yeah.
core idea, the core method of economics
Yeah,
and
I think
growth
that's a
theory?
generous interpretation of what critics of growth, the mistake that many critics of growth are making. I think what's going on is something slightly different. It's a slightly different misjudgment in terms of how they're thinking about it. There's a slogan which has become increasingly popular in parts of the environmental movement that infinite growth is not possible on a finite planet. So, David Attenborough, for instance, the voice of nature himself has been quoted saying as much. And there's another slightly different version, which is that anyone who believes on infinite growth on a finite planet is either a madman or an economist. So that's but it's basically this idea that we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And that, and this is one of the big arguments of the book, is that, in my view, is just fundamentally wrong. That we can have effectively infinite growth on a finite planet. And the reason it's wrong is for a slightly different reason to the reason that you're suggesting, which is that I think what a lot of critics of growth today are inheriting is a sort of 18th, 19th century view of the economy as a sort of material place, where the things that matter are the things that we can see and touch with our hands, see with our eyes, that we can drop on our feet. And the origins, I think, of the disposition are completely understandable. So when all those founding fathers that I was talking about, Smith, Mill, Ricardo, and so on, were writing, the world around them, the British economy, was overwhelmingly a material world. People worked with their hands. You could count, on the farms, like you could count inputs into and out of production in a factory. And clearly, if all that matters is the material world, then there are so many, finite things out there that we can use. But the key insight, it seems to me, that comes from modern economic thought about the origins of growth is that growth doesn't come from the material world. It doesn't come from the world of tangible objects, but it comes from the intangible world of ideas. And ideas have all these interesting properties, that they're non-rival, that they're non-excludable. But the key point is that whereas the world of sort of finite resources, material resources, is finite. There's only so much material stuff out there. The world of ideas is unimaginably vast. For all intents and purposes, as good as infinite. And so, if growth comes not from using more and more finite resources, but from discovering new ideas about how we can make ever more productive use of those finite resources, then the kind of constraints, the bottlenecks to growth, aren't to be found in the sort of material world of those finite resources, but it's to be found in our inability to discover enough new ideas about the world. And that's a kind of big, when the second half of the book is what we do about growth and the challenges it presents, and that's a big theme, that if we want more growth, we need to become societies that discover new and more interesting ideas about how we can use the resources that we have.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of critics of growth might look to Marx as sort of an inspiration, but really Marx was on the opposite side of this whole story, right? I mean, he was one of the biggest critics of this Malthusian trap, right?
And he thought this is one of the ironies, that sort of what makes him stand out from his sort of classical contemporaries is sort of his optimism about growth. He thinks that economic growth through capitalism is necessary to create the sort of material abundance that he thinks will be required in the sort of his ideal world to come. It's actually quite if I was to pick out a classical economist who is more optimistic about the prospect of infinite growth on a finite planet, it would ironically be Marx.
But Marx also didn't really have a theory about what drove it or what caused it.
No, not in the same way that we think about the sorts of theories that exist today for thinking about growth. Yeah.
Now you point to Solow, right, as
Yes.
the kind of inspiring figure, and I think we all agree that he is the guy who started thinking about total factor productivity.
Yeah.
But in a way, his theory is incomplete because it's a residual, right? It's
Yes.
sort of like, the unexplained bit is what's driving everything, right?
That's exactly right. And the thing that really matters, I can't remember who first said it, but it sort of drops into the model in a kind of, mathematical miracle, like
Yeah.
manna from heaven. And it's incredibly important, but it's completely exogenous. And it takes, in my view, 30 years, 35 years. So there's this sort of, what does Solo and in Australia, Trevor Swan show in the 1950s? What they show is that the thing that drives economic growth, and when I talk about economic growth, I have in mind, sustained increases in per capita GDP. The thing that drives that is technological progress. That's the only thing that can offset the sort of curse of diminishing returns that have preoccupied Malthus and others. But the kind of origins of that technological progress are left unresolved. And it's the great and what's slightly puzzling, and when you look back on the sort of intellectual history, is that it doesn't really feel like in the decades that followed, until Lucas and Roma, that economists were really jumping to try and fill that explanatory hole. There was a sense in which technology was something that economists just weren't particularly well equipped to think about, that they should sort of leave it unexplained and mysterious. And of course that changes as the 80s come and the 90s begin.
To what extent is GDP, if in fact our growth is coming from ideas and not from stuff, isn't our measure of GDP antiquated to some extent, because it was created in a world where most of the production was around physical things?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly right. I think the GDP measure, it's actually, there are two big problems with it, or at least two big problems with how it's used today. One is its sort of technical failings, which is that it's meant to be a measure of the activity that takes place in the market, and it's not a particularly good measure. Exactly as you say, many of the things that we use today are free. Think about the search engines we use, the sort of email browsers and so on, the sort of first generation of generative AI systems, whatever it might be, we don't pay a price for them in the market, and so they're not captured by traditional GDP statistics. The other thing, of course, that GDP is very bad at capturing is quality improvements. And if you think about particularly sort of the sort of technologies that we use, something like an iPhone today, it might have the same price as an iPhone X many years ago, but all the different dimensions on which the quality of that technology has improved just aren't captured. So I think there are lots of kind of technical limits with GDP as a sort of technical measure of the sort of activity that takes place in the market. And one of the arguments of the book is that, look, we need to do better. We need to try and repair those technical failings. But there's then another movement which is really influential, and it goes right back to the work of Kuznets in particular in the US when the GDP measure is being created, which is a realization that the GDP measure not only has sort of technical limits, but it's also got moral limits, that it's aspiring to be a measure of economic value, and it's not a particularly good measure of social value. That there are lots of things that we value from a social point of view which are not captured in GDP, and there are also lots of things that are captured in GDP that we don't particularly value from a social point of view. And so there's also, as well as trying to improve the technical limitations of GDP, a very influential movement that tries to kind of identify the other things that we think are valuable and important, socially valuable and important, and bundle them into a sort of more perfect GDP measure, like the state of the environment, like the level of inequality in society. And on that one, I think that's a big mistake. I think we should try and repair the technical failings of GDP, but these kind of contemporary attempts to try and make it also a sort of moral measure of what matters are just doomed to fail.
Set aside the moral side of things.
Yeah.
And just focusing on the technical. It seems like GDP is both under and over inclusive, right?
Yeah.
So, it includes things that shouldn't be thought of as productive output, right? And I think this goes back to the debate about whether military spending ought to be included.
Right.
We know that if there's a big earthquake, GDP goes up because everybody has
Yeah.
to rebuild their houses, or
Yeah.
if everybody gets sick with COVID, it's like, all right, well, GDP
Yeah.
goes up because we got to build all these plexiglass barriers and stuff
Yeah.
like that. Or
Yeah.
and
Yeah, I mean, there's an argument that I can't. There was an analyst, I think, I can't remember the particular bank, who looked at the BP oil spill back when it
yeah,
happened and calculated that it would be because of all the cleanup activity, it would be a benefit to growth.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And this was it Henry Hazlitt, or who was it that wrote that book, back in the 40s, about if you break a pane of glass and repair it, or dig a hole and
yeah,
refill it, like that's how you can,
yeah,
create GDP.
yeah.
And so, in that sense, it's over inclusive. I mean, is there a way that how could you come up with a coherent way of distinguishing between so-called, useful GDP, and is there a way, or do we just have to give up on
So,
that project?
this is sort of what and what's interesting about the military spend issue. It sounds like a sort of technical quibble, but actually it was the great dividing line between Keynes and Kuznets. Keynes wanted to include government spending in his measure of GDP. Kuznets didn't, and it was why. In the event, the sort of British version of the measure was the one that caught on, the one that did include government spending, of which, of course, military spending is part of it. But the reason Kuznets didn't like it was in part because he thought that military spending was not from a technical point of view, wasn't market activity, but also because it had this sort of unpleasant moral flavour. That actually, a lot of the criticisms of growth and a lot of the criticisms of GDP, and we've rattled off some just now, are actually less to do with technical issues of mismeasurement and more to do with our feelings that are sort of morally uncomfortable about including them, like the BP oil spill, like prostitution, like like military spending, like advertising. That was another big one that preoccupied. And part of what I'm arguing in the book is that actually our uncomfortableness with a lot of these emissions and commissions with respect to GDP come from a feeling that it has a kind of moral weight that it ought not to have. We ought to recognize that GDP is this incredibly technically flawed measure, and we shouldn't aspire for it to be a measure of what we really value and care about. And that our uncomfortableness with those sorts of stories about BP, or including military spending, or including prostitution, or including drugs and so on, are not really technical things, technical concerns with the fact that we're measuring things badly in a market, but they're moral concerns that we're measuring things that we ought not to be including. And so I think a lot of this debate about GDP is driven by these sort of moral anxieties, and what we ought to do, I call it GDP minimalism. We ought to try and diminish the role that GDP plays, because I think it will help deal with some of these anxieties about what is and what is not included in it.
Yeah, but I mean, an economist could say, hold on, this is not a moral discussion, right? I mean, if you have a company and the company is, manufacturing earnings by cutting its R&D, or, manufacturing earnings by stuffing channels or so forth, I mean, the stock price goes down if people become aware of it, right? Because they're just pursuing a metric, but the metric doesn't capture what you're really interested in. So couldn't the people who are critics of GDP have a point that if we're depleting natural resources, in other words, if there are externalities that aren't captured by the market prices, I mean, shouldn't we make some attempt to incorporate that into our measure to the extent that we know what they are? I mean, if there's no carbon tax, but we're clearly, or there's no price on fishes or whatever. I mean, shouldn't we make some attempt to think about what the quote stock price would be? Right?
That's right, and it feels intuitively very, very appealing. But what it forces you to do as soon as you accept that argument is two things. The first is you have to say what other things you think are valuable and important. And we might be able to agree that the state of the climate and the environment is something that we think is valuable and important, but there are other things that GDP affects, where there might be more, that the pursuit of GDP and the pursuit of growth affects, where there might be more controversy. Say, and one of the interests in the book is the health of local places and communities. The fact that you get shared meaning and purpose from work in particular places, not just an income. perhaps talk about more. But so the first thing that you've got to do is say what other things you value, if not the activity that takes place in the market. And that is a morally really difficult, contested question. The second thing you have to do is that even if you can agree on the set of things that we ought to value that aren't valued at the moment, you've then got to agree how to balance them, how to weight them, how to sort of trade them off against one another. And both of those seem to me to be very difficult normative questions about what we value and how much we ought to value them. And they're not the kind of questions, in my view, that can be answered satisfactorily by statisticians and economists working in treasuries or statistical offices. They're the sorts of questions that and this is a big theme of the book, that have to be put to citizens and put back to politics.
Well, you also have discussed this debate on whether or not we should be including black market activity or crime. Like the gangsters and the mobsters who are, hey, they're creating value, right? And Italy magically created its.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And my view is that we ought to actually, we have to be clear what GDP is useful for. And I think we need to go right back to where Keynes was and just say, look, this is useful as a kind of statistic for governments to get a sense of what the taxable income is in an economy. And we ought to include the stuff that helps us figure out what the taxable income is, and that's what we ought to use it for. And we ought to try and get rid of some of this moral charge that the measure has. I mean, part of the theme of the book is that this thing has sat at the center of our collective lives for so long that the things we measure, even if in the beginning they're not really the things that we care about, we measure them for other reasons, become the things that we care about. They kind of have a moral weight because of all this collective attention that we put on them. And I'm trying to, it's a small part of the book, this focus on GDP, but nevertheless, I think it's a controversial one because it runs in the opposite direction to the direction that many people are moving in at the moment, which is to try and build a bigger, better, more improved GDP measure that resolves all of these issues we're talking about. And I just think that can't be done either for, it's technically very difficult, but also I think it's morally unpalatable.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of people who are concerned about the so-called great stagnation, right? I mean, I interviewed Bob Gordon, about this, and I mean, is this also just an artifact of the metric? I mean, Bob Gordon talked about how the metric, even as it currently operates, understated the impact of things like electricity. You talk about the price of light and so forth.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he's right in the sense that all the big gains in things like life expectancy, I mean, they're probably exhausted. But the fact that I can get 200 million songs or whatever off my phone.
Yeah.
I mean, we kind of discount that and say, well, that's not as cool as electricity and locomotives. I mean, is that also a problem with the metrics that we're using?
Yeah.
And should these people who are concerned and anxious over the great stagnation, should they worry a lot less?
Yeah. I mean, I have a sort of other anxieties about the sort of Robert Gordon diagnosis of what's going on. I mean, in short, it might be true that all the low-hanging fruit has been picked, but that really doesn't mean that there isn't other fruit on the tree. I've written, as you said, back in 2015, I wrote a book called The Future of the Professions, looking at the impact of technology on work and then on white-collar work in particular, and then more recently, A World Without Work in 2020, looking at the impact of technology on the labour market more generally. In neither of those books did I mention large language models. They simply weren't talked about 24 months ago. They weren't, and yet now when we think about what technology might look like in years to come, what sort of trajectories, technology, artificial intelligence might take, it's absolutely center stage. It seems in thinking about the pace of technological progress, the past is not always a particularly good guide to the present and to the future. We have at the moment, if you listen to what the leaders of the large artificial intelligence companies at the moment are saying, whether it's Sam Altman, whether it's Demis Hassabis, all of them are saying that within 3 to 5 years we can expect systems that are able to outperform human beings at every cognitive task that they do. Now, I've historically been skeptical of those claims, and I think that there's lots of reasons why they would want to talk optimistically about their technologies. But even if that is attach whatever probability you want, the kind of both the technological opportunities and the technological challenges from that sort of thing are just completely immense. And it feels to me arguments about picking low-hanging fruit in the last 100 years are not a good guide to the sorts of things that are taking place.
Well, look, as long as we've had technological progress, we've had people who were concerned about the impact, and in particular, a lot of people are concerned about, oh my gosh, we're going to lose all these jobs, right? And most economists will point out that the 90% of the people who were farmers back in 1800s, they're not sitting around unemployed. Right? I mean, they figured out other things to do. But it seems like with every new technology, there are people that are saying, well, this time it's different. And I think with LLMs and foundation models, everybody's thinking, okay, now this time for real, we're going to have all these people lose jobs. And I mean, to me, it's always seemed like a composition fallacy, right? Because if you're going to produce all this wealth, somebody's got to be buying it, right? I mean, in equilibrium, you're going to find new things to do. Is there any sense in which there might be some technological improvement that would essentially make large parts of the population, I don't know, redundant or have nothing really to do of value?
I mean, so I think you're exactly right about the starting point, which is that ever since modern economic growth began 250 odd years ago, people have suffered from periodic bursts of anxiety that the technologies of the time would take on the work that they do, and by and large, they've been wrong. There's always been enough work for people to do, and when there hasn't been, it's not been because of technological progress. And so, the big, caveat that by saying, of course, there have been incredibly, transitional times where people moving from, say, agriculture to manufacturing, and from it's been very difficult, and there's been frictions, but the historical story is not one of large pools of permanently displaced workers because of technology. And so you're exactly right. I think the question is this time different? And I think the short answer to why it might be different is that these systems are just becoming increasingly capable. They are taking on more and more tasks that in the past only human beings alone could ever do. Human beings to some extent are being driven into specializing in a sort of ever shrinking set of capabilities. The longer answer, and this is what I try and set out in A World Without Work, and where a lot of my more formal economic work has been over the last 10, 15 years, is that when you look at the different economic forces that have tended to increase the demand for displaced workers in the past, I think there are good reasons to think that because of this, what I call task encroachment, that these systems are just relentlessly taking on more and more activities, there's good reasons to think that those helpful forces, those forces that have complemented displaced workers in the past, might be weaker in years to come than they were historically. And just a sort of one way of thinking about this is to think about what's happened in chess, for instance. Human chess player is better than a machine. 1997, Garry Kasparov gets beaten by Deep Blue, and at first it looks like this is the triumph of machines over human beings. But actually, what it transpires is that while a machine playing a human being might beat that human being, a machine playing a human being plus a machine is less effective. And so what happens in chess is that there's this movement of so-called centaur chess, that actually a human plus machine is better than a machine or a human alone. And that becomes, if you read the books that Gary Kasparov has written about chess, that becomes how he thinks about not only chess, but also thinking about the impact of technology more generally on the labor market. That working with these machines, we are stronger than either working alone or a machine on its own. What's interesting, though, of course, in the last few years is that centaur has effectively been decapitated. That human beings simply get in the way of the machine. Whatever it was that human beings were bringing to the chess table in that cooperative relationship can now itself be done better by the machine alone. And so no one really talks about centaur chess anymore. But I think there's a general lesson here, which is that these technologies might complement us at particular tasks and activities as they have in the past. But as these technologies become more and more capable, they are going to take on those complemented tasks and activities as well. Another example, I think of global position, sat-nav systems in cars. In the beginning, sat-nav systems complemented human drivers, right? They made human drivers better at the wheel. They could navigate unfamiliar roads. They could get from A to B more efficiently. But in a world of driverless cars, where human beings are displaced from the task of driving a car by a machine, these sat-nav systems will just complement the machines instead, making them more productive and more effective. So it's just a sort of flavor of the kind of argument that I'm making, which is that it's a mistake to think that the sorts of tasks and activities in which human beings are currently complemented by technologies, complemented by technological progress, will always be there. In the past, there were huge realms of activity in which displaced human beings could kind of seek refuge from automation, but it seems to me that set of activity is diminishing.
But I mean, is that just a lack of imagination? I mean, I when I think of my job, it's like, man, if I could automate every single thing that I currently do, I still have a list of a gazillion things that I need to do or could do. And if my driving was 100% automated, that'd be fantastic. That would free up another couple hours. And it's not just for leisure, but for actual value producing activities that I would love to do. I just don't have time for. And certainly when I look at people that I interact with, whether they're at the university or, my insurance agent or whatever, I'm always like, why aren't they doing this? Why aren't they doing this? And it's usually because of time constraints and labor constraints. I mean, is it just lack of imagination to figure out the new things that people could be doing with their time?
Yeah, and that's often been an argument, which is that, who could have possibly imagined 5 years ago that people would be doing the sorts of things that they do now? Just one like really contemporary example. Anyone who has spent any time working with generative AI systems, whether it's GPT, whether it's Midjourney, whether it's Sora, whatever it might be, will know that there's a kind of narrative about them that they're just sort of sapping the creativity out of the sorts of tasks that they do. But anybody who's spent any time with them knows there's an extraordinary amount of skill and capability in crafting a good prompt. Getting these systems to do what you want is an art form. And what I've been particularly and I didn't imagine this is that now there is a sort of emerging career of so-called prompt maximizers, people out there who are particularly good at writing prompts for these systems, who sell bundles of these carefully curated prompts to those like me who are less good at them. It's the equivalent of who could have known pre-internet that so many people would be search engine optimizers. Now each new technology creates new roles, and so I think it's from an imaginative point of view, it is very difficult to imagine the sorts of types of tasks and activities that people will do in years to come. I think we can identify those sorts of tasks and activities where human beings will retain the upper hand. We can also, I think, identify tasks and activities where even if they could be automated, we decide for moral reasons they ought not to be automated. So, I'm part of this Institute for Ethics in AI at Oxford, and one area that people say we will never automate is the right to certain types of human decision making in the law. A sense that only a human being ought to be able to give you a particular type of sentence, however advanced these technologies get with respect to sentencing. And we use them already to inform parole decisions, but you might just say, look, there are moral limits, that there's going to be tasks that we could automate, but we decide not to automate. Then I think there's also tasks where actually the thing that we value is the very fact it's done by a human being. You walk into the Sistine Chapel and look at the roof and think, gosh, isn't that beautiful? But you also think, isn't it amazing that a human being painted that thing? And I think, you could
automate the priest's job.
They
already have recordings of church bells that they use. Right?
Divinity and white collar work is one of the professions that I'm really very interested in. I think it's what technology is doing to the sort of literally white collar work is very interesting. But so just to come back, the kind of the argument I'm making is not that there aren't tasks and activities out there that human beings could do. The argument is that there's no economic law that says there's going to be enough demand for that stuff to keep everyone in well-paid work who wants to do it. On the contrary, as that kind of range of activities shrivels, as these systems become more and more capable, it seems to me, and it goes to your sort of compositional point, that there's just no reason to expect that the demand, enough demand, will fall on those particular types of tasks and activities, So I think I am sort of alive to the kind of imaginative constraints with this, talking about the future. But I still worry that even in a world where there are things that for people to do, there just might not be enough demand for them. So it's a less cinematic concern, I think, but I don't think it's any less troubling.
Well, what I find interesting is the impact on the inequality of performance, right? So, it seems like a lot of the evidence suggests that the people who benefit the most from using these tools are the ones who are the kind of worst performers. And this may be a very short-term effect where they're brought up to kind of par with the experts. The way I think of it is with investing. If you go back to the 1960s, everybody was an active investor. Everybody was picking stocks. And then we had this incredible revolution in finance, right? And all of a sudden passive became the way to go. Yep. And so everybody started indexing, and this was fantastic, except that it created new opportunities for a new type of active investing. And so, we got rid of kind of the worst performers. They all kind of went right up to the average. Yeah. But then now, this creates a new type of investor. So, in a world of passive, it pays to be active. In a world where everybody's using ChatGPT, this just sort of raises the bar for everybody, right?
Yeah. I mean, what was interesting, I think I that's the read I've had on lots of the sort of more formal studies of these technologies. What's interesting, though, is that this is a sort of, what it reminded me of was what happened, the role of technology in the sort of late 18th and early 19th century. We've got used, the story of technology in the 20th century was a story of, what economists called skill-biased technological change, that particularly the personal computer in the 80s, and then the software and, word processing and, spreadsheets and so on, that what these technologies really did was complement the work of high-skilled workers. It wasn't that these technologies, displaced large numbers of people from their work. In fact, they increased the demand for skilled workers to use these technologies and put them to, productive use. And so, the concern of a lot of economists at the sort of turn of the century was about the skill premium. How could it be that we had such an increase in the relative supply of, college-educated people in so many labor markets, and yet the skill premium, their wage relative to the wage of those who just had a high school education still rose. And the story we told was this skill bias story, that the types of technologies that we developed in the 20th century just increased the demand for these skilled workers so much that their wages still rose relative to the unskilled. What's interesting, though, is that if you look further back in time, you see a very different story where actually technologies appear to be biased in exactly the way you're talking about towards less skilled. So in the 18th and 19th century, there's a sense in which a lot of the technologies in the Industrial Revolution were allowing far less expert people to produce the kind of wares that might have required, far more expert people and far more skilled people in the past. People talk a lot about the Luddites, about the apocryphal, named after the sort of apocryphal Ned Ludd, who was the English weaver who went around smashing machines at the start of the Industrial Revolution. What's interesting, though, of course, about Ned Ludd, if he were to actually exist, is that he would have been a skilled worker. He was the person who was threatened by these technologies. And
he would have been like an investment banker in the 70s who was, smashing the computers that had Excel on them,
Yeah, well, no, or more. He would. The investment banker in the 70s wouldn't have done it because he was the only person who could use Excel. The better analogy is the investment banker today smashing up a Google data center because these technologies are allowing people to be, to invest without their expertise. So there's something interesting, I think, in how the bias of these technologies has changed over time quite dramatically, and it's something, one of the big themes of the book Growth that we were talking about before. The new book is that actually this bias that these technologies have towards particular types of particular factors, or biases of lots of different types, are themselves not exogenous given things about the world, but we can change them too. The technologies that we have at the moment might be growth promoting, but they also damage the climate, they lead to widening inequalities, they in my view challenge the existence of good work for many people, they undermine our political system, they ruin local places and communities. But it doesn't have to be that way, that we can redirect these technologies, that we can change the sort of bias that they exhibit, and in doing so protect other things that we value while also pursuing prosperity. So I think these biases are really interesting and important.
Well, I mean, is there also a consumer preference for things that might involve the human touch, right? I mean, one of the things that we've seen as people have gotten wealthier, at least in California, in my environment, is that they're willing to spend more on things that have some human element, right? I mean, you buy the meat that is. The ex-lawyer who quit his job as a partner at a law firm to raise pigs. And, these pigs get like massages and listen to Mozart and stuff. And,
that's right.
And it costs like 10x what you would pay at Costco. But, people pay for that. I mean, if we look at, go to watch the 100-yard dash. I mean, if you want to beat Usain Bolt, just, get in a golf cart. But, we don't pay to watch, him race against a golf cart. We say, hey, we're going to pay to watch people run in all of their natural glory with no steroids and so forth. So
that's exactly right. So I completely agree. And what, just hearing that, what it reminds me of is there was a story about a Michelin star restaurant in Britain where people came for dinner and they were served coffee by an automated capsule system. And what's interesting about these systems, of course, is that in blind taste tests, people really struggle to tell the difference between the sort of automated capsule and the one that's kind of handcrafted by the the barista. But when they found out that the coffee was made by one of these automated machines, they were completely livid. We're at a Michelin star restaurant. Why are these?
I'd be pissed.
Yeah, why is this coffee not being made, handcrafted? The pop of the beans, the crack of the grinder, the tamp of the, all that. And what's going on there, exactly as you're saying, is that even though they, couldn't tell the difference between the type of coffee and a blind taste test, what's going on there is that they're valuing not just the outcome, the taste of the coffee, but the process as well, how it's produced, how it's made, and the fact that it's crafted by a human being. It's a little bit like that Michelangelo example from before. And again, I think it's certainly the case, and we can already see it in contemporary economies, that lots of people can find work creating, doing sorts of things where the very fact that a human being is doing it is the thing that's valued. And it's not just, coffee or, hand massaged beef. It's also, more, with no disrespect to meat producers, consequential parts of the economy, like, for instance, education or healthcare, where sometimes people say, look, it is the very fact that it's a human being sitting there at the end of my life with me that really matters, or it's the very fact that it's a human being standing at the front of a class. So I think, there are, but again, it just comes back to this key question in my view, which is that, and this key uncertainty is there going to be enough demand for those residual activities to keep everyone in work who wants work? Is there going to be enough demand for that hand massage beef that everyone can, find work as a cow farmer? And it's a sort of glib point, but there's a serious one, which is there's no economic law that says that must be the case.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of it could be policy. I mean, if you once we realize that we have all this new wealth that we've created, then we can start to increase certain standards and say, all right, listen, factory farming was something that we needed to do, and when we needed it for nutritional purposes. Now we're in a place where maybe we can afford to give the chickens a better life, right? And that's going to, of course, create more demand for certain types of labor. But I mean, you talk a lot about the degrowth movement, and I think that the key takeaway that I got from this is that the degrowth movement it's in some ways a quasi-religious movement or an aesthetic movement, right? That it is impervious to any empirical disagreement to some extent. I mean, is there something, I don't know, quasi-Christian about it, right? Where we're supposed to feel bad about, growth and prosperity, and that, it just by itself is something that we should be concerned about, irrespective of any evidence around environment. I mean, if we were able to say, reduce environmental destruction.
Yeah.
And I think people might still say, hey, that doesn't matter. We still don't want growth.
That's right. And I think you're getting at something really interesting there, which is, I sometimes suspect that some people in the degrowth movement almost feel disappointed at our capacity now to decouple the pursuit of prosperity from, say, carbon emissions, that the progress we've made in the last 20 years is not something to be, celebrated and welcomed and encouraged. I mean, it's kind of like
the Marxists, right? They're like, hey, you increase the quality of life for the working class. Like, that's a bad thing because it means it delays the revolution, right? It makes it less likely to happen.
Yeah. I mean, there's another point as well, which is, I think, that often actually the frustration isn't so much with growth, but actually a sort of deeper frustration with capitalism. That there's a kind of concern that it was sort of that growth is just a sort of symptom of, and I write a lot about this in the book, because what's so interesting, of course, is that growth was absolutely central to socialism. In some ways it was more important to the socialist system. But I think I think one of the things about degrowth is that it is very easy to dismiss out of hand, and I think that's a mistake for a few reasons. One is it's increasingly popular. It is something that has become increasingly prominent. We have leading politicians, leading environmentalists, leading activists, all appealing in different ways to it. It's also one of the interesting things that has been drawn to my attention since the book came out a few weeks ago is how popular the sort of philosophy is in the corporate setting for how large organizations think about growth and their obligations to the climate. It's a very some of the sort of ways in which the degrowth movement think about growth and the economy as a whole has sort of trickled down to how companies think about growth in an organization too. So I think it's it's quite a pervasive idea now. Certainly wasn't 20 years ago. I think it's also useful in the sense that and we've touched on this already, that I think it's rooted in a sort of misunderstanding about how economic growth actually works, that it comes from using more and more finite resources, and that just isn't where growth comes from. It actually comes from discovering more and more ideas about how to make productive use of those resources, and so they're looking for the constraints in the wrong place. But I think that the kind of the deeper thing is that they get something right, which is that something has to give. We haven't spoken about it too much today, but at the core of the book is what I call this growth dilemma, which on the one hand is this fact that growth is associated with almost every measure of human flourishing. But on the other hand, it's also associated with many of the great challenges that we face, whether it's climate change, but also to some extent the growing inequalities that we see in society, the chase for new technologies like AI, which are disrupting work and politics, the loss of particular local places and communities as industries have declined. And so there is this tension, this dilemma, and by just pursuing growth so relentlessly, the argument of my book, and I think this is partly inspired by the degrowth movement, is that that pursuit is coming at too high a cost. We are pursuing the wrong type of growth, that we cannot keep on going as we currently are. So I think to that extent, the degrowth movement gets something really important right.
Yeah.
And we got to not dismiss that out of hand.
Well, I mean, I think it's very difficult to disagree with that. I mean, if you think about at the individual level or the family level, certainly income is something that we value, but we make trade-offs all the time, right? I mean, every day you have to decide, do I keep working or do I go home and spend time with my family? Do I go cook some meals? Do I go and, do some sports? So why wouldn't it make sense at the much higher level of a country to think in terms of those trade-offs?
Yeah, I think that's right. And what it also does, though, is I think one of the big mistakes of the degrowth movement is that it takes the trade-off between growth and the climate as fixed. That the sort of technological possibilities that we have are given. It's kind of a sort of
in some way, if I can figure out a way to boost my income and work fewer hours, then increasing my income doesn't come at the expense of time with my family or time in leisure. Right?
And you can see something analogous happening. I mean, this is sort of what's happened in the environmental setting over the last 40 years. Now, there's still a lot to do, but if you go back to 2007 and look at the Stern Review, written by Nicholas Stern, first report of its kind into the economics of climate change, written in the UK, one of the big conclusions he reaches is that it would cost 1% of GDP a year to reduce carbon emissions by 80%. So there's a big trade-off between growth and the climate. You've got to pay a big price in terms of growth to meet our climate ambitions. 2008, next year, he comes forward in The Guardian and says, no, I got it wrong. Climate change is worse than I thought. It's actually going to cost us 2% of GDP. Trade-offs got worse. The price in terms of growth is higher. Fast forward, though, to 2020, and you have the UK Climate Change Committee. So that's the task of the set of experts who are tasked with advising the British government on climate change. Their conclusion was that to completely eliminate emissions, so not simply reduce them by 80%, but to completely eliminate them, would cost just 0.5% of GDP. So the trade-off between the economy and the climate had dramatically improved. We have to pay a far lower price in terms of growth to protect the environment. So the big question is why? And the answer is that essentially 40 odd years of changes to taxes and subsidies, rules and regulations, social norms and cultures have just completely transformed the incentives that people face in society. And so there's really strong incentives now for people not only to develop new technologies, and as we've spoken about, that's the stuff that drives growth, but to develop green technologies that promote growth and also do less damage to the environment. The great example being, I think, solar energy. 1970s, it really is a tool of last resort. So if you want to generate electricity in outer space or in an isolated lighthouse, you use solar. Fast forward to today, and it's completely commonplace. And the reason it's commonplace is because of the technological progress that's taken place. Something like a 200-fold decrease in the cost of these technologies over the last few decades, and explosive increase in uptake as a result. And so what has kind of relaxed the trade-off there is technological progress, particular types of technological progress. And one of the big mistakes, I think, that the environmental movement made in kind of projecting ahead for thinking about the challenge of climate and the challenge of the environment when they were doing it earlier in the 20th century was to take the sort of technological possibilities that existed as fixed, as exogenous, in truth, in much the way that the early economists did as well. And actually, what we now know, both from theory and evidence, is that we can change the direction, change the bias of the technologies that we develop, not just in the context of the conversation before, whether they're biased towards low or high skilled workers or indeed workers at all, but also whether they're biased towards green technologies or dirty technologies or politics disrupting technologies or politics supporting whatever it might be. And that's a big thesis of the book, that the technological possibilities for weakening these trade-offs between growth and these other things that we care about are enormous. And my optimism, and the book is an optimistic book, comes from a feeling and an intuition and an instinct in when I'm looking ahead to the future and all the uncertainty that we face, that we will be able to weaken many of those trade-offs in ways that, again, you talked about imagination before, in ways that we will find hard to imagine now.
So, I mean, the key mistake seems that they assume that output and inputs are correlated, and the any increase in output is going to require an increase in these finite inputs, which may well not be true.
Yeah. I mean, there is one of the great frustrations. I'm sort of hesitant to tar the degrowth movement with any particular, although I'm guilty of this already in this conversation. But one of the great frustrations with the degrowth movement is that there are just so many different accounts of what it is. Its strength, which is that it's interdisciplinary and is also in some sense its weakness, because there's just so many kind of competing ways of thinking about the problem, and it's not always obvious what it is. I don't think people in the degrowth movement really know what they're agreeing or disagreeing with each other about. It's just, and so part of what I try and do in the book is set out what I think degrowth is about, and how it actually is used in practice by those who talk about it and those who promote it.
Well, now, of course, economists, although sometimes they fall into the trap of equating utility and money, I mean,
Yes.
they really focus on utility. And so we could potentially have all these other metrics like the happiness index, or what is it, the Scandinavian index, and so forth. And I think one of the key points that critics of growth make, which I think is valid, is that you don't always see a perfect correlation. And indeed, the pace of change that we're experiencing now oftentimes leads to a lot of anxiety and a lot of unhappiness, particularly in the world of work. And especially when people invest so much of their meaning in their work. Do we need to kind of rethink that, just as a culture, the role of work in our happiness? I mean, I know Keynes predicted that we'd all be living lives of leisure, which hasn't really happened. I mean, we've got more leisure, but we don't have, we don't work an hour a day. Yeah. Do we need to rethink what work is? And does it make sense to just discard this whole notion of a job? I mean, a lot of times people focus on this. I hate this idea of a job. I think of a job as a very limiting definition of work.
Yeah. To race to Keynes' defense, although he doesn't really need my defense, but I think we do work in many developed countries less hard than at any moment in our economic history. Just a sort of side point, but I think you're absolutely right, which is so in the last book, A World Without Work, part of my background is in policy making before I returned to academia, before I trained as an economist, and and wrote books. I worked in the Prime Minister's strategy unit in the UK, and then in the policy unit in Downing Street. So I'm when I come at these problems, I'm often interested in the sort of the practical side of things, the policy side of things. And it seemed to me, in thinking about a world with less work, if you sort of take the kind of the premises given, it presents two challenges. The first is an economic challenge, which is how do you share our income in society if our traditional way of doing so, paying people for the work that they do, is less effective than in the past. The labour market is the main way that we share our income in society. So the economic problem, it seems to me, is a distributional one. But there's also, exactly as you say, I think, this meaning problem as well. Work is often said not simply to be a source of income, but also of meaning and purpose. And if that's right, then the challenge of a world with less work isn't just that it might hollow out the labour market and leave some people without an income, but it might also hollow out that sense of purpose and meaning too. And that is, I think, a far less. It's a really difficult problem. I'd say a few things about it. One is, and this is what I do in the book. I mean, one is that although people say there's a strong relationship between work and meaning, actually there's a lot of heterogeneity. Actually, a lot of people do not get meaning from their work. If they could get an income without working, they would. And you can see this in the kind of simple polls that are done. Lots of people do not get meaning and purpose from their work. They don't think they're making a meaningful contribution to the world. It's, I think it's often, the people who write about this stuff are sometimes confusing the sort of meaning that they get from their work as a kind of generalizable insight. I just don't think it's true. The other thing, of course, is that if you look back in history, there's also a lot of heterogeneity too. You can find different societies where there were very different relationships between work and meaning. So, Aristotle, Plato, supposedly Socrates, all thought work was a kind of prohibitively grubby affair, that it was to be avoided at all costs, and that you'd find meaning and purpose elsewhere, outside of work. And so all of this is to say that I think this relationship between work and meaning is, on the one hand, incredibly important, but on the other hand, not very well understood. And just to kind of hammer that point home, I mean, I mentioned before that book, A World Without Work, was written in January 2020. And of course, what happened in March 2020 was that the pandemic began, right?
Right.
And we found ourselves in a world with less work, not because robots took everyone's jobs, but because of the pandemic, because of the virus. And what was interesting was that many of the challenges I was writing about in that book that I think we'll face because of automation, we had to face because of the pandemic. So, we had this economic challenge. How do you share our income if people aren't able to work? And in the UK we had the furlough scheme. In the States you had checks through front doors. We were grappling with the economic problem, but we were also, in an interesting way, grappling with the meaning problem. One of the things I found really interesting about the pandemic was the way in which there was a lot of public discussion about how to best spend our time in the kind of enforced idleness that we found ourselves in under lockdown. So in the UK, for instance, you couldn't get, if you went to a DIY site, you couldn't get timber to, repair a fence or paint a bathroom, because everyone had bought it because they were doing up their homes. We had a national shortage of yeast because everyone became a bread maker. There was a scramble to kind of find meaning and purpose when work was no longer available. And the conclusion I drew from that was really that while I think we have a good sense of what gainful employment looks like as a society, I don't think we have a good sense of what gainful unemployment looks like. And if you take seriously the prospect of a world with less work, and you attach, non-negligible probabilities to the kind of prospect for technology that leading technology companies at the moment talk about, then I think this gap in our understanding about meaning and purpose is really significant, not just from a sort of intellectual point of view, but really from a practical policy point of view.
Well, I mean, that could potentially solve the problem, right? In the sense that it could increase demand. The increase in prosperity from productivity could increase demand for these meaning-producing activities, some of which would be provided in the market, and some of which would be off market. I mean,
Yeah.
domestic work certainly contributes to prosperity, but it's not something which has ever been included in GDP, even though it is productive and creates meaning potentially.
Yeah, I think one of the most controversial ideas that I write about is the idea that the state might need to take a role in shaping the kind of opportunities and requirements that people have for meaning and purpose in their lives in a world with less work. We have a whole range of interventions that we developed over the last couple of 100 years for shaping people's working lives, labor market policies. Might we also need a similar set of interventions to shape people's non-working lives, their spare time too? And if you take that sort of idea seriously, then there's a really interesting sort of collective conversation to have about what sorts of activities do we think are valuable and important, which might not necessarily be valued in the market, that we want to nevertheless recognize. Work done at home, I think you mentioned, is a really good example of one. Whether it's domestic work or care work, whatever it might be. Volunteering. There's so many types of volunteering that are extraordinarily valuable. I think the value of the volunteering done in the UK is equivalent to the value of the sort of energy sector here. It's an extraordinary amount of value in the work that's done. Of course, not done in the market, but it's nevertheless very valuable and important. And then, of course, there's a sort of the activity that has traditionally interested sort of political philosophers and others, which is kind of politics and collective activity as being something that's valuable and important. But that's an interesting kind of conversation too. What do we think? Today, people contribute to society through the work that they do and the taxes that they pay. And if you're not in work, but you're able to work, there's a sort of expectation that you actively seek work. And indeed, support from the state often is conditional on actively looking for work. In a world with less work, where you can't find work and you can't make that economic contribution, what other kind of contributions do we offer people? Do we provide people? Again, it's a very unfamiliar question, but if you take seriously this premise of a world with less work, it's the kind of question that we need to be thinking about.
Well, sometimes they say idle hands make the devil's work. Let's hope that's not true. Right? Well, you mentioned politics. There might be some political movements that are soaking up some of this this extra energy, which might not be conducive to growth or happiness. But Daniel, thank you so much for joining me. The latest book is called Growth. Fantastic book. But don't forget A World Without Work and the Future of the Professions for all the folks out there like me who are in the professions. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.